Hello and welcome to Belaboring the Point. I'm your host, Kate Riga. I'm joined here by TPM's very own Josh Marshall after we just wrapped a conversation with TPM's other own, Hunter Walker and Luppe Luppen, who have just finished up a book about some of the internal divisions of the Democratic Party. Their book kind of stretches back to the 2020 campaign. And in our conversation, I think we connected it to a lot of the bigger narrative themes that are kind of big topics of conversation today. So what do you think, Josh? Terrible conversation. Nobody should listen. Like super flop.
Yeah, this is a great book that I actually read a few months ago because I blurbed it. And one of the interesting things is, as you said, it's about divisions in the Democratic Party, but it's actually about how the party overcame those divisions in 2020. So it's a sort of a Democrats in array history of the last 5 years. And I thought the conversation about it was really great. I think the book is a fascinating one. It's a narrative history, not like a manifesto or takes or something like that. And we had a really enjoyable and interesting discussion of it. And we're also going to publish an excerpt from it on TPM.
Yeah, I think what's most interesting is the book is kind of a corrective to this idea that's constantly laundered through, mainstream media and the beltway media and everything, that progressives are the problem, and that they have these like unrealistic expectations and they can't temper that with the realities of legislating. And even after Biden's first term, I think that's still like the most default set for those stories. Like that's, you can tell people are trying to shape the stories into those contours. And that was not at all the story of his first 2 years, and particularly the story of the biggest legislative accomplishments of his presidency so far, which were achieved kind of on the backs of progressives, with, as Hunter and Lupe call, these radical centrists being, the biggest source of kind of consternation during those negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, as you said, that there was always that in the BBB and Inflation Reduction Act era, a lot of the coverage was still framed around progressives and centrists, the divisions between progressives and centrists. But as we get into in our discussion, in most of those cases, what we were calling centrists here were like three people, and then the entirety of the Democratic Party. And so the great majority of the people who, in any real sense, we have called kind of centrists or the establishment or something like that, were voting the same way that the progressives were, and were voting with Biden's plan. So in a lot of ways, it gets into the ways that model had broken down, and that's how we got to supposedly one whole faction of the Democratic Party was actually this dude from West Virginia and this kind of very strange woman from Arizona. you know Weird.
Totally. And I think where the conversation got the most snarled is like the future and some of these big pressing questions about the 2024 election, because I mean, obviously every single Democrat or Democratic adjacent person is like bedwetting nightly over Biden's, over young voters seemingly apathy towards Biden, his age issues, questions of if he can rebuild the coalition from 2020, and the disconnect between his legislative accomplishments and his like quite progressive governing, and the base's dissatisfaction with him. And I thought that tension was so interesting because he managed to kind of do this incredible thing, which was unify the party in a way that Obama wasn't necessarily able to do, and to get progressives not only to buy in, but to really like, trust him. Like there's a lot of details in the book about these very kind of nice, serious relationships between progressive members of Congress and the Biden administration. And yet we're on the precipice of 24 when Biden has like governed the way that kind of young people profess to want to be governed, and he's still facing huge kind of fall offs with that group. And then it raises a bunch of other questions, which we kind of got into about, is the issue that young people are not uniformly progressive, and that is a shorthand that is not capturing the moment? Is it because you've got these young people who are disaffected and not really paying attention at all, and so are really more than what we think of as young voters, low information voters, right? So it's just all, I think a lot of those threads kind of shot through our conversation and shoot through the book and are instrumental when we're thinking of like what is next for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, one thing just to conclude our introduction to the conversation you're about to hear is I think we got into that in a lot of this discussion of centrists and progressives, when we talk about, you know, the progressives, in some ways there's kind of at least three different things we're talking about. On the one hand, we're talking about electoral progressives, people who are in office who are progressive. We're also talking about electoral progressives versus the progressivism of the street, and by which I mean like protest politics. Again, a lot of overlap, but they're distinct. And then finally, generational politics. You know, what do people under 30 care about? And what is their level of involvement in politics? And those are all really key issues that were key in 2020. And that's what this book is about. That kind of unexpected rapprochement, and they're key to 2024. And they overlap, but they're distinct. And when we think about things that seem contradictory or don't seem to fit, often they fit once we kind of step back a little and see that, okay, when we're talking about progressives or the base or stuff like that, it's those three things are kind of mixed together, but they each have dynamics that are unique to them. And just for this, you'll hear in this conversation that we're about to share with you, here we've talked a lot about progressives, and that's clearly in a lot of ways um, what we're talking about for 2024. We're talking about the youth vote. We're talking about, is Biden going to be able to pull back into the fold basically younger voters who are some mix of very progressive and just disaffected? But the book, that again I read a few months ago and is really good. The book is about both sides of that divide in the Democratic Party. The establishment wing, the more moderate wing, that Joe Biden is from, and the more progressive wing that in 2020 was Bernie Sanders' wing, and how those two groups learned to work together in 2020 and had a successful election. And I think to many of us have had a successful legislative 3 years in office, as long as we understand that legislating with 50 votes in the Senate is, you don't get everything you want. But with that, I guess, Kate, you want to lead us into the main part of our discussion?
Yeah, and with that, enjoy our conversation with Hunter and Lupe on their new book and all these myriad narratives that it touches on. So enjoy. Hello and welcome to Belaboring the Point. I'm your host, Kate Riga. Today, TPM's own Josh Marshall and I will chat with two very special guests, authors of the upcoming book, The Truce, Progressive Centrists and the Future of the Democratic Party, which is out January 23rd. So today we're joined by Hunter Walker, TPM investigative reporter and former White House correspondent, and Luppe Luppen, a lawyer, reporter, and commentator who lives in New York City. Hunter and Luppe, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
So to start, can you just give our listeners kind of the elevator pitch thesis of the book and what you both set out to understand by writing it?
So I think this book gets to a couple questions that a lot of people have right now. And just to set the stage a bit, obviously there's been this glut of reporting on Donald Trump and how we got Donald Trump as everyone's been sort of reeling over the past 7 years. And there hasn't been as much reporting on the Democratic Party and the other side of the aisle. And I think especially with the 2024 election, approaching, uh, people have started to sort of look back on that and ask questions about, what happened to this Bernie Sanders progressive movement that made so much noise in 2016 and 2018? And then also in conjunction with that, how did we end up with Joe Biden? And how did we get this sort of elderly centrist figure who seems out of step with a lot of the momentum that certainly the younger wing of his party has had in recent years. So our book really dives into that, and I think we came up with some answers to some of those questions. Firstly, and you see that in this excerpt that we're running on TPM. I think Bernie, especially in 2020, came a lot closer to victory than people realize. Um, Ultimately, you know, Biden did manage to win. Part of that was sheer luck. Some of that was the remaining institutional strength of the Democratic Party. Um, but also some of that, and, you know, I think one of the myths of Joe Biden is this Republican caricature of him as almost a Manchurian candidate being kind of puppet mastered through his old age. But he is a savvy operator. And you get some glimpses of that in this book. And one of the things he did was forge an alliance with the progressives. So the progressives didn't go away. They kind of became part of the Biden ascendancy. And that's the titular truce that we explore in this story.
Yeah, the alliance was one of the most fascinating pieces of the book to me, especially how it kind of took place during the campaign and how it transcended that division when Biden got elected. Can you guys kind of talk about that a little bit? And particularly, I'm kind of obsessed with the Jayapal Ron Klain relationship. Like that was so fascinating.
Sure, and I think the sort of spark for that comes out of the caucus night in Iowa in 2020, where you have this sudden and unexpected problem of no one having a result. I think all the campaigns had planned out what they were going to do if they got the sort of springboard from Iowa of a victory, and what they were going to do if they had the kind of the core base motivation of a defeat. But what almost no one planned for was what happened, which is that you had a kind of null result that left the party without anyone with clear momentum, that shielded some folks like Joe Biden, who didn't do too well in Iowa, and that put the party in a position of having to find a way to build momentum later in the race. And that dynamic, I think, pushed together a group of people who might otherwise have fought a longer battle and had a longer primary, and has given us, from that campaign moment into the ultimate consolidation of the party behind Joe Biden, the structures that were put in place to build the Biden campaign and sort of fold the progressive campaign infrastructure into it. These what were called unity committees that the Biden campaign ran. Those relationships that were forged in the aftermath of Iowa and the consolidation of the primary build into Joe Biden's presidency, and we see those alliances, the sort of bridge from the White House to the progressives who had been Bernie Sanders supporters and who were working on the Hill after the election. We see that that relationship being sort of the bulwark of what Biden's been able to accomplish in his presidency. And what one of the most interesting things we found is that you don't see sort of centrists versus progressives dynamic on the Hill for the most part. You see the centrists of Biden's world acting in alliance with progressives in a sort of more radical wing, which you might call centrist too, of sort of Joe Manchins of the world working as the disruptive force to that kind of alliance.
And just to pivot off what Lupe was saying, um, you know, there's just been so many takes, and I think the two of us are really of the view that takes are a dime a dozen. And this book is not that. This is a deeply reported sort of history of the last half dozen years of the Democratic Party. And we were really big on basing it in hundreds of interviews with key players at every level, um, and kind of letting them do the talking. And so when you see, these Democrats come together, this unity task force with progressives be kind of baked into Biden's campaign, we saw these characters on the Democratic side of the aisle who were really pivotal and really important. And one of them, Kate, is Pramila Jayapal, who you mentioned. And she just became a real player in the early days of enacting Joe Biden's agenda in the face of Joe Manchin and what we term these radical centrists.
Josh, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the chapter about Iowa is, I mean, for our listeners, is really really good, and I mean good in the sense of like absolutely excruciating. I mean, it was like it was palpably painful to read, but because it's so well put together and there's so much in there, and I think to a certain extent, I think most of us who follow politics, certainly Democratic politics, have a recollection of that. But one of the dynamics of that moment was that it happened so quickly and so many things had to follow from it that there wasn't a lot of time to kind of sit back and say, wow, how'd that happen? Or what was that about? Or kind of like, what's the, what's the shakeout from that? But I found it just a fascinating narrative read because there's so much detail there, and as you say, it wasn't that. I mean, there's no question that on balance, for the candidates who mattered, it hurt Sanders more than it hurt Biden. I mean, it probably helped Biden just because it kind of it made inconclusive where he had taken a huge hit, but really everybody was sort of like flattened by it, and you just see it unfolding, and again it's just this it's I don't usually recommend to people things that are excruciating, but I mean it's excruciating to read because you just see it all happening, and it's like it's like a slow motion car wreck, and you see blood spurting here and blood spurting there, and the blood spurting from this person splashes onto this person's face. I mean it's horrible, but but as the book unfolds you see all the things that that come out of there, um uh laying the groundwork for what came after. And just to follow up on your other point, Hunter, about how close Bernie came, he certainly did. And there was, I mean, again, I think there's a lot that happened in that campaign and that you unfold in the book that for a lot of us it's compressed because that's when the COVID pandemic started. And a huge and not the factor, but certainly a key contributing factor to how this really improbable result came together was COVID, was the onset of the COVID crisis, um, because there was this 2 weeks, I would say, when it really did seem like, okay, Bernie won. Like, and you see a lot of the sort of establishment, centrist, moderate, whatever you want to call it, wing of the party saying, oh, okay, like I guess this is how we're going to do it, and certainly a lot of people weren't happy about that, and that's a big reason why it didn't happen. But at least in my read, that he's the guy, but then everybody kind of sees, well, he's the guy, but with like 30% of the party. So if everybody, if everybody else consolidates against around someone else, he won't be the guy. And then that kind of happens, and all at once, COVID happens, and COVID is just sort of someone coming into the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl and saying, "We're calling it. We're
Exactly.
freeze. We're going to end it right here," and that happened right when through this people see that different way. A lot of factions in the party like, let's go with Biden. And then COVID happened and the refs come in and say, okay, done. we got 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter, but we're done. And that's kind of what happened. Anyway, I just wanted those 2 points. But for those listening, that Iowa chapters is honestly worth getting the book on its own. And it's not just the Iowa chapter.
And we should be clear, that's running on TPM. You can read most of the Iowa chapter, but there's actually even more that I think, just for length reasons, probably are just going to be in the book. And you can really see how it was, a series of extraordinary events and errors. And one thing that I've really come to find after years of reporting on the campaign trail is, a lot of this stuff is just office politics, right? It's just intrapersonal dramas and, behind the scenes things, to the point that one of the pivotal moments in Iowa was the failure of a spreadsheet app. And yet, they have massive, massive high stakes involved. And especially with COVID as the ultimate kind of force majeure, it ended up compressing the timeline and magnifying the effect of all of that. And I think Bernie, one big Achilles heel he had both in 2016 and then again in 2020 as he was doing better, is so much of his strength lay on the West Coast. And that's just later in the primary schedule, in a race where, as we explain in the book, momentum is kind of the coin of the realm. So that's part of the reason that, one of the big fallouts from this is, as Faz Shakir, Bernie's campaign manager, put it, quote unquote, cluster in Iowa that we saw in 2020, is that they are totally remaking the calendar for 2024. And, as much as we're answering the questions that I think people have now, we're also pointing to, I think, some questions that people should have. And one of them that we're going to see unfold in the next 8 weeks or so is what exactly is going to happen with Democrats in the primary season. And I think anyone who reads this book will come away realizing that it's much more up in the air in a very technical, mechanical sense than I think people realize.
And just to tack onto that, I think, as you pointed out, Josh, there are these moments where a big event or an outside force can determine a lot of what happens in politics. As much as we like to focus on individuals and their intentions and coalitions and voting, the dawn of COVID really puts the stopper on Bernie Sanders' campaign in a way that the candidate himself acknowledges. And there's no more primary after COVID. In the same way, I think what we found in Iowa, digging into the details and looking at all the blood and the gore, is that a lot of the blame falls on the Iowa process itself. That Iowa is so complicated, so difficult to administer, and run, in this sort of jury-rigged manner, that it produced the non-result more than anyone's intention did. And that Iowa process is something that the Democratic Party is now reaching in and rejiggering. They've taken Iowa out of recognition as the sort of first in the nation contest, and they've also moved around their calendar so that New Hampshire will be alongside some other states, and a different state is going first. There's a lot changing in these processes that are ultimately very, very important to what sort of outcomes we see from the American electoral system. And a lot of it's happened behind the scenes, and we've tried in our own small way to sort of lift the curtain on what's going on there and give people a preview of what's likely to happen in 2024.
It's funny. I was refreshing my memory, and it's possible that what I'm remembering is a product of that compression. But some of you may remember there was this not press conference, kind of rally where I believe this was the one where Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg endorsed Biden. I may be off about that, but if I'm off, I'm only off by a few days. And it was the one that some of you will remember. Simone Sanders tackled this protester who came on, like Biden comes up. I don't know if it was a Sanders adjacent protester or just some kind of more left than Biden protester, but he comes up, tries to get on the stage, and Simone Sanders comes barreling through and like tackles the guy like something out of professional wrestling. And again, I think that was the one where those two endorsed, but if it wasn't, that was a few days later. And that was like the last rally of the campaign, basically. And I looked it up right now, it was March 3rd. So maybe there's a bit more, but it captures the way that COVID just, kind of brought the kibosh down on the whole thing. And that was it. And kind of, that was what it was.
Yeah. So I think moving past the campaign a little bit, you guys touched on this at the beginning, but Democrats in disarray as like a trope is so common, that people are like always kind of complaining about it on Twitter. But usually the idea behind Democrats in disarray is that the like unreasonable, shrill, progressive wing is like refusing to live in reality and has these wish lists that are just that they can't live in the same world where you legislate kind of thing. But during the first 2 years of Biden's term, all the consternation during the big legislative lifts originated in the kind of right wing of the party, right? The quote unquote centrists, the quote unquote moderates, the cinemas, the mansions, the Gottheimers, like those players. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how much of the kind of relatively smooth relationship between the White House and the progressive wing was like presaged by these, campaign time kind of cooperatives?
So that's a really great observation, and it really is one of the fundamental things at play in this book. As Lupe was saying, the forge of the campaign and then the pandemic on top of that kind of brought these folks together. But I also think that what brought them together was this shared realization that Donald Trump was an existential threat to democracy. And certainly we talk about that a lot on TPM. And that's something that I think most Democrats were extremely aware of. And so you saw, progressives in part because Biden and particularly Ron Klain had built these bridges for them to do so, come on board and sort of confront that with Biden. But then at the same time, kind of counterintuitively, you see at this moment when it kind of seemed like they all had this shared goal, um, the Salt Caucus and Gottheimer and No Labels and Manchin scuttle a lot of Joe Biden's early agenda. And that's where we sort of came away with that phrase, radical centrists. And I think it's really interesting because it is counterintuitive to the way cable news, I think in particular, talks about this dynamic. I mean, a big pet peeve of mine is just how much the sort of never Trump wing of the Republican Party dominates the discourse in this Trump era. And, A, I question how much real constituency they have, but B, I question, when they weigh in on the Democratic conversation, how much of that is in good faith. And I think they do set up the conversation as sort of you outlined, Kate, where it's like, oh, progressives are the problem and Gen Z is unrealistic and this and that. And really, they work together to get things done legislatively with Biden, while the roadblocks to his agenda came from Manchin, came from moderates in the House. And I think the big existential threats that we're talking about in terms of questions going forward in 2024 are these sort of third-party things, whether it be, Manchin running with No Labels or someone else. So yeah, I think digging into that dynamic was interesting because we found how Democrats are more together and less in disarray in some senses, but how there are real fault lines. They're just not the ones I think people conventionally expected.
I think one thing there, and this what you're saying is so accurate that it kind of the definitions get a little off. That in some ways, what we have talked about in the Biden area as like the moderates or the centrists are like a splinter group from what we used to call the establishment wing of the party or the centrists or whatever that is, because one of the if you look, not even someone like me who kind of looks back to the 90s and the aughts and stuff like that, even if you look at a much more compressed time frame, one of the biggest kind of people I know online, against the Manchins and the cinema, were the guys who run Third Way, right? Which is like the classic, moderate, central, whatever you want to call it, triangulating wing of the Democratic Party. So whereas the big story and the very narrow margins that they were able to pass what they did pass was both factions of the party working together, and then a couple stragglers who, because of the narrow margins, were able to block a lot of stuff. And I mean, again, it's just so few people. It's like, even if you include the people in the House, you're talking about a dozen people total between between both houses of Congress. And that basic alliance being, we're going to basically work with Bernie's agenda, but we Biden will do it. Like, you let us do it and we'll do your stuff. And that's kind of how we're gonna, that's the basis of that alliance. So let's jump to, I thought it would be interesting to discuss where we are now, because now we are actually seeing, at least for now, at least for the moment, as long as this conflict in Gaza and Israel plays out, we're actually seeing a lot of those divisions play out in a pretty big way, in a way that they didn't end up doing in 2020 and through a lot of the Biden administration. It's not exactly centrists and progressives. It's kind of, it's part of that. It's also generational, but you're seeing it in a big way, with a lot of constituencies in the Democratic Party being very upset about what has been unfolding in Gaza over the last 6 weeks, and not only upset about it, blaming Joe Biden for it in a domestic context. So how, with what you looked at in this book, how do you see that, and how do you, like, are those alliances ones that over time, looking forward to 2020, to next year's election, a year out from now, can those repair this breach? Is that strong? Is that strength great enough to pull this back together, or is this kind of going in a new direction now?
Well, we are, as Hunter said, we try not to be pundits in promoting this book, and we know that takes are a dime a dozen, especially about conflicts that are currently raging. And so, in my thinking about it, I'll try not to be opinionated, but to stick with what our reporting might add to this, which is that Joe Biden has been unpopular. I mean, ever since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think we've seen him steadily in the lower range of what presidents get for approval ratings, and that has not changed, for years. And at the same time, we have watched and reported on his administration moving the ball forward in the ways they can with the narrow margins they have, knowing that a lot of people are angry at them, knowing that they don't have too much of a bully pulpit with their approval numbers. And we've seen them make, a number of accomplishments that I think, going into the reporting, at least if I was asked to handicap it, I wouldn't have thought they could do. Where, the Build Back Better Act, we cover this in great detail in the book. It has all of these sort of deaths and rebirths. It goes on for months and months and months, and ultimately they have the big crisis where Joe Manchin basically throws them out of his office and they can't get anything done. And then a couple months later, they come back and they figure out a way to produce a package that's not everything, but that has a big climate package, has a big legislative achievement. And the reason I'm going down this tangent is that I watch sort of the cable news drama about this. I see how angry people are, how outraged they are, and I feel it myself. And at the same time, I see progressives demanding a ceasefire, and then I see a ceasefire happen that's brokered by this administration. And it may not be everything people want. It may not be the full, the emotional delivery that I think some presidents are better at than Joe Biden. But I do see this administration getting things done. And I think their political challenge is, how do you bottle that and sell it as a political win, especially in a circumstance where people just are not that fond of you. And I think that is the riddle that Biden has struggled with. And at the same time has also, despite his low approval ratings, has achieved a pretty good result in the midterms for a first-term president, and has achieved a lot of legislative wins despite these challenges. So I see it as sort of a continuation of the dynamic we've seen throughout this presidency of an unpopular administration that manages to get things done.
I also would throw in there, one thing that we touch on in this book. Josh, you were pointing out how it's not entirely sort of progressives versus centrists. And I think one of the figures who has shown that most starkly on Gaza is Bernie Sanders, and his position really is in line with Hillary Clinton's, where, he is not fully for a ceasefire. And his sort of more nuanced support for a two-state solution while calling for the military eradication of Hamas is actually more in keeping with kind of the liberal Jewish perspective than the larger progressive perspective. Um, and the book closes with our interview with Bernie, where we touch a bit on his Jewish identity. And I think it's really interesting because it's always been something that he has been reluctant to talk about. And as a fellow Jew from Brooklyn, I've always tried to get him and push him to talk about it. And we sort of came as close to that as we could in this book. And the takeaway I got both from Bernie and his staff is that, Bernie grew up in a Jewish immigrant community in Brooklyn. His mother died when he was very young. And that experience is really what sort of radicalized him around, pursuing universal health care and fighting for the working class. At the same time, he literally physically ran away from New York and has like never been personally able to talk about this painful chapter of his life. To the point that one of the revelations we have in here is that, his staff, was basically begging him to do this in 2020 to the point that they crafted what they called the quote unquote human Bernie memo, sort of saying like, please, like tell your own story. But I think one thing we are seeing on Gaza, at least when it comes from Bernie, is, a little bit of an indication that he is informed by that Jewish perspective as much as he has his own progressive take on that.
I think also that if you look at his bio, as you said, he has not just not talked about this a lot. He's clearly gone to some lengths not to talk about it a lot. But if you look at the scope of his life, and when he does either speak about it, or you just look at you look at his biography, time he spent in Israel, whatever, you can kind of see that this is not an incidental part of his kind of, I don't want to say personal identity because that's loaded, his personal experience over the course of his life. Let me just to follow up with what I just asked. As I said, I think what is going on in the Democratic Party right now, and for people who might be listening at some point in the future, this is the 27th of November. We're kind of, at least for the moment, in what may be the first ceasefire of maybe of a few in the Israel-Hamas war. But as I said, that to the extent we have a division now, it's not just progressive centrist. It's clearly generational. It may be more generational than conventionally ideological, but that generational issue is going to be a big one in 2024. I think we saw even before October 7th, we saw that generational divide was maybe the biggest challenge that Democrats had going into 2024. Just in the sense that a lot of poll analysis and commentary has talked about that you've just got a lot of young, sort of more leftish, but maybe more just disaffected than leftish voters who are even more disaffected. They are people who have kind of been in the Democratic coalition, but maybe they're questioning it. Again, going back to what you learned reporting on this book and how this played out in 2020, what light does that possibly shed on what we're going to see in 2024? And I guess I'd put it most specifically, the ability of for lack of a better word, progressive elites. And here I just mean that in the sense of people who hold office, stuff like that. I'm not using it in a qualitative or certainly not pejorative sense, that those people can mobilize those voters if they choose to in 2024.
That's an excellent question. And I think one that I still have a lot of questions about. I think, one thing we didn't touch on in Gaza that I think is that, Hunter's point goes along with this, is that there have been a number of progressives who've not taken, have not fallen into one particular camp on the conflict in the Middle East. I think of Senator Fetterman, for instance, who's been starkly pro-Israel in his political messaging, and who, from what inputs I have, from what I can tell online, has faced a lot of disaffection from people who had been his supporters, um, who who are not feeling the same way about the conflict that he is, and that I think there is always a question of, when you have a party in power, a party that has a sitting administration, and there are members who are maybe to the left of the administration who are working with it, and who are, exercising their own electoral, their own official duties. What risk do they face of losing the support of the progressive movement at large, and fracturing, what is always a difficult coalition to keep together, and finding when they come to the next election that they'll have fewer people to call on? And I think that is a question that remains to be answered. Hunter may have a more specific view on this, but I think there's, whether progressives feel like they've gotten a good deal out of the Biden administration and out of their representatives in Congress is, I think, still something that's up in the air. And, as reporters, we can document what has actually gotten done, but we can't predict how people are going to feel about it.
One thing, that I think the book does capture is just how much this question of the youth vote is sort of a holy grail for Democrats. And we literally, early on in the book, I don't want to reveal too much, but we get a sense of President Obama's mindset on that, and how much that was on the minds of many of the newer members on the Hill. Um, and it makes sense because, a fundamental thing here is that if you look at the demographics of the country, you know, this should be no problem for Joe Biden, right? By and large, we have a young, diverse, liberal country, but the result hasn't always shaken out that way. And part of that is the Electoral College, but part of that is this question of enthusiasm and turnout. Um, Another thing that I think we capture in a bit of a granular sense is sort of what Kate was talking about before, just how these divisions don't always break up as simplistically as the conventional wisdom posits that they do. And, what I mean is, for example, when we look at Joe Biden's grand win in South Carolina in 2020, and that was really, the origin of the, story that it was black voters that propelled him to victory. You were even seeing in that race that actually younger black voters, even in a relatively conservative state like South Carolina, were actually breaking a bit for Sanders. And it wasn't that simple. Really notably, Bernie Sanders in the 2020 primary seemed to resonate with Latino voters in a way that, Joe Biden seems to have been failing to do. And I think a rightward drift among Latino voters and Joe Biden's failure to sort of match the enthusiasm that Bernie had in that demographic is a big, big story in 2024. And so the fact that Joe Biden essentially needs high youth and minority turnout to win is, I think, part of what makes this Gaza question so, so crucial. Because as Josh has been saying, you see the youth, sort of demanding something that whether or not Biden has been able to deliver it, they are certainly, not feeling satisfied. And then also, I think this polling on Arab American voters is particularly crucial, especially since, that is a huge demographic within Michigan. And, within the dynamic of the Electoral College, that is one of the states that matters most. And the fact that we're seeing them, really break away from Biden so far is really something that could be crucial. So I think, you know, young voters, voters of color, those are the key to a second Joe Biden victory. And Gaza is one of those situations that can really, throw that into chaos.
I think also, there's as you said, when we talk about, centrists and moderates and progressives, these catch-alls gloss over a lot. And one of the things that is within progressive politics in general in the United States, perhaps in other countries too, that you kind of mean two things. There's, on the one hand, um, electoral progressive politics, and that's the squad that is the progressive caucus in the House. It's people who are operating in electoral politics. And you also have, for lack of a better word, the progressive politics of the street. And by that, I mean protest movements and stuff like that. Now, these overlap a lot, but in basic ways, they're different. And you saw some of that during the Trump administration writ large in the protest politics of the Trump era. You saw it particularly during in June of 2020 with the protests around the murder of George Floyd. And I think and so there's always there, how much do they diverge? And I think kind of what we're seeing right now is certainly those two parts of progressive politics in the United States are directionally on the same page right now about what's happening in Gaza. But it's really the sort of the progressive politics of the street that is in some ways kind of seems to be driving the car right now, in the sense of having a kind of totalizing protest that basically says, too bad about coalitional politics. This is worth breaking coalitional politics. And that's kind of, I think, where we're gonna, how that shakes out, whether it's, kind of who's running that is going to tell us a lot about how 2024 functions.
I think you're right that, this tension between electoral and protest politics is a really defining thing for progressives. And one area where we saw that, and you can see that in great detail in the book, is inside of the Democratic Socialists of America. And we have a chapter that kind of looks at how pivotal they were to the rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And within that moment, you can see them have sort of an existential crisis over whether to even get involved in electoral politics. And, this woman who ultimately has become kind of the face of democratic socialism in America is someone they weren't necessarily on board with embracing because they didn't see her as socialist enough, in part due to litmus tests that included, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, because they have been one of the biggest voices on that front. So I think, the rise of groups like that both shows the continuing influence of protest style politics, but it also shows the limitations. I mean, they in that instance managed to get involved in electoral politics, but it by nature is sort of a struggle for them. And I think we tried to capture some of those conversations behind the scenes so people can understand how those dynamics play out in a real practical sense.
To loop together another kind of current topic of discussion with some narratives from your guys' book, you talk a lot about how important, the kind of caps lock narrative is to campaigns and how so many moving pieces kind of build those, much of which seem to be kind of out of control of the candidate. I think part of the reason the Iowa caucus chapter is, as Josh says, excruciating is because you have these pressures of the Biden or the Sanders staff being aware that with every passing hour, they're both losing fundraising opportunities and kind of losing the opportunity to shape what's going on and to shape it in terms that are kind of most favorable for Bernie. And right now, how do you think this kind of fixation on Biden's age fits into that dynamic? And is this something kind of based on your reporting that you think can be overcome? Can his progressive alliances help him overcome it? I mean, what do you think of kind of that current moment?
I think there's a constant between the 2020 election and the 2024 election in that Biden was already old in 2020. There was plenty of talk about him being old, him being stuck in the basement, him, and the further right you went in the kind of commentary you listened to, the more you heard about, the sort of Rudy Giuliani conspiracy theories about Biden being a puppet, a Manchurian candidate who doesn't understand anything and is just sort of propped up by advisors and dark forces. And so I do think that there is at least a familiarity to that trope, and we've seen a, a Biden campaign overcome it, even in the challenging circumstances of a pandemic and a lockdown, where they faced, I think, some serious criticism about his age and his capacity, even in the last presidential campaign. Those obviously those concerns haven't gone away. They are a part of everyone's. And I think it's kind of an easy thing to talk about when you talk about American politics. The age of the politicians is an easy thing for everyone to relate to, for everyone to understand, and becomes a part of everyone's sort of baseline analysis of where the campaign is and is going. And so I don't think it's absolutely clear they'll overcome it, but I also think it's probably the most familiar challenge that they're dealing with in their political in their list of political problems right now. And they are fortunate and probably facing a Republican nominee who's almost as old, and who will take that issue, or at least make that issue a little bit less potent when people point out that Donald Trump is, 77 or 78 during the campaign.
A spring chicken, right?
That's right.
Hunter, did you want to jump
A
in?
Ute.
Yeah, I think also, like, as much as our book answers the question of how we ended up with Joe Biden, this series of lucky coincidences and improbable alliances that helped this, guy make it through on his third try. We also are looking at how we didn't end up with Kamala Harris. And she's a big character in all of this. And I think, there's an alternate universe where there was a very seamless handoff after the first term between Joe Biden and his much younger, female, diverse vice president. And when you start to look into her campaign and how it imploded, which we do also in, sort of excruciating detail, you can get a sense of why that didn't happen. But again, I think this is something where, we are not sort of reducing her to the cable news caricature. And as much as Kamala Harris has had a lot of struggles, we also capture, how she's been a bit of a savvy operator and how she's tried to assert herself within the White House. And I think one of the things, as much as their relationship has not been totally smooth, one of the things that I found really interesting was we kind of heard contemporaneously from White House sources about how Kamala Harris was a big driver in making abortion central to Biden's argument out there in the past couple midterm races. And it's been extremely, extremely successful for them. So I think one thing, Lupe is absolutely right. We do need to recognize that Trump is almost as old as Biden. And one thing Biden has that Donald Trump doesn't is these allies and surrogates, whether it be Obama, whether it be Kamala Harris, whether it be the Squad and Jayapal, who I think will be assets for him as he confronts that issue on the trail.
So I want to wrap up with two kind of big picture questions. The first is, how would you describe where the party is now in terms of this kind of push and pull between, the old establishment guard and the progressive wing?
Array, but fragile array. I think that there's, I hate to to be the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen moment, but I do think there is this fragile truce between progressives and centrists, and I think that what you've seen is that the sort of centrists who are not, who aren't being Joe Manchin, who aren't being disruptors in the middle of the party, but who are trying to figure out how to govern, have been moving more and more towards the progressive side of the party. And I do think it's part of a sort of generational move that pushes the Democratic Party a little bit further to the left. Not as far left as some of the folks we interviewed would like, but I do think that you see the party moving in a more progressive direction in a very, very painfully slow and glacial way that I think will resolve as you, in sort of a natural way, as you see young members of Congress get elected, as you see the 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 leadership turnover finally in Congress and a new Democratic leader head up the House conference. That I do think progressive ideas are likely to be more and more mainstream as the Democratic Party moves into the future. Um, at the same time, I do think that progressives always struggle to hold on to the mainstream and also to hold on to their identity as progressives, because every time that Overton window moves a little bit to the left, you see more people who are further out to the left who are suddenly more relevant in your politics. And so we'll see whether in 20 years I'm right or wrong that people recognize the Democratic Party as having moved left. But I do think that, compared to where things were in Congress in the early 2000s, when my political consciousness was just sort of coming online, I do think we're in a much more progressive place amongst the Democrats who've been elected.
I think also one thing that is clarifying and is sort of implicit in a lot of your book is that two things we conflate is progressive policy on the one hand and movement politics. And they overlap to a significant degree, certainly now when the institutional Democratic Party is slowly moving to the left. But that is really the sort of the division point, I think, in many cases, that um, the Democratic Party has moved very consistently to the left over the last 15 years. So by any definition, that's clear. But what it will always be um, antipathetic to and resist is movement politics by definition, because movement politics, in a very basic sense, just doesn't work with the way that um, institutional parties work in the U.S. two-party system, and that you see that division point um, come out a lot in again, I think in a lot of ways implicitly in your book, but certainly uh, you know today and what we've seen in the Biden years.
I also think it's important to note that as we talk about the party moving to the left, we're not just talking about Joe Biden sort of being pulled along, right? This is a guy who's had his own vision. Um, and, I was at the launch of Joe Biden's campaign. It was sort of, in Pittsburgh, surrounded by labor, and labor has been really core to what he's done. Uh, and I think both in terms of the policy standpoint, particularly with the focus on labor and infrastructure, but also in terms of these things he's done behind the scenes that we chronicle, such as the Unity Task Force, such as having a chief of staff, Ron Klain, who was on the phone with the leader of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal. Biden is a transitional figure. He's literally a man of a different era, but both in terms of policy and behind the scenes, he set the stage for progressives to take the reins going forward. And of course, all of that is just assuming we do have a democracy in 8 years from now. But if we do, I think Biden will be recognized as someone who kind of quite literally effectuated this truce and paved the way for the heirs of the Bernie revolution to kind of move into their next roles in government.
So go ahead. You want to jump in?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think a lot of that is built, as you'll see, hopefully you'll see in the book, is built off of the reaction that the party had to this disaster in 2016. And that is the sort of the jumping off point for all of our reporting. Is the Bernie movement, I think, showed the Democratic Party's more centrist elements that they had to react or face, a truly marginalizing moment. And I think that the story of our book is largely how they reacted and how that the outcome in 2016, both of the primary and ultimately Trump being elected in the general, has affected the Democratic Party. And that's sort of what Hunter and I set out to chronicle, is not to do another Trump book, not to talk about what the sort of the great evil in Mordor, but to talk more about, how this sort of fellowship between progressives and centrists came to pass, and how they're trying to fight to preserve our democracy.
So the last thing I want to ask you guys is, do you think to any degree the unity of the Democratic Party kind of depends on Trump? I mean, it certainly kind of emerged out of his election. And, if so, what do you think happens, like, when, whether by prison or death or what have you, he at some point goes away from American politics?
It's an excellent question. I think there is undoubtedly, we have been living in the reaction to Trump's election for 7 years, and that has absolutely shaped the Democratic Party going forward. I think my perception is that it's also shaped a Republican Party that isn't going back to the sort of more staid Bob Dole kind of Republican presidential candidates that we've seen in the past. That they are in, as I see it, a dance with this sort of um, authoritarian impulse. And whether it's Trump who's on the stage or not, I think um, they are going to see that journey continue. That's my, again, that sounds much more like a take. And I didn't want to offer a take, but that is my perception of Republicans, is that they're not, they have found an affection for that style of politics that I don't think is going to die with Trump or go to prison with Trump or whatever. However Trump leaves the stage, I'm not sure it's going to leave with him.
Yeah, I think your question, Kate, really gets to a fundamental tension within the Democratic Party. I mean, I really agree with Lupe's characterization that Democrats are in array, but it's a fragile array. And we've chronicled this alliance, but it's a shaky alliance, and we go through all of the reasons for that. Whether it be sort of personality differences among the progressive wing, these raging radical centrists, or what I was alluding to earlier. I mean, just the idea that Democrats haven't settled on a primary schedule or process going forward. And I promise you that's going to be a fight, sort of as we saw in 2008, the last time they tried to shake this up. So there's all these reasons for Democrats to fight. And will they give into that if they lose the unifying threat of Trump? I think what it comes down to is that with this authoritarian bent, Republicans are really leaning into this sort of minority rule, um, fear governance. And it's easy to sort of hold together when you're kind of thinking of a almost great replacement kind of, us against the world mentality. Um, Democrats have numbers on their side, but that will always be harder because you're trying to bring together a diverse coalition. So, that is the fundamental dynamic that we'll all be watching going forward. And I do hope, people find in reading this kind of recent history of the Democratic Party that they can understand it a lot better.
All right. So once again, the book is The Truce, Progressive Centrists, and the Future of the Democratic Party, out on January 23rd, 2024. And keep your eye on the TPM website for a tantalizing, excruciating nibble of that book to come around the same time. Hunter and Lupe, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having us and for all the kind things you said about our book. I really appreciate it.
Belaboring the Point with Kate Riga is a TPM podcast. The show is hosted by me, reporter Kate Riga. The show is produced by the excellent Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to our good friend, Why Not Jansfeld, for our podcast theme song. And thanks to our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcast and subscribe wherever you listen.